Hello, my name is Eric Westerkamp, and I'm the CEO of CaliberMind. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how you can leverage the power of generative AI along with all that data you have as a marketer sitting inside of all of your different systems to really understand what the buyer journey looks like for your different prospects. So to start, your typical B2B marketing organization has a number of different sets of data that they're kind of looking at and bringing into their platform and their systems. They've got everything from CRM data, data coming from their marketing automation platform, whether it's HubSpot or Marketo. You have all these different customer interactions that may be happening, events that they go to, emails that they exchange kind of with your sales team, and other types of interactions that your organization has with all of these prospects and customers. You've also got information coming to you from ad sources, whether it's LinkedIn or Google or Bing or Facebook. And you have potentially intent data. So this may be data coming to you from intent data sources, Bombora, G2, something like that, which may allow you to understand whether or not a customer is sort of getting interested in something that you sell as an organization. And what you're really looking to do is answer very specific questions that are kind of buried inside of this data. For instance, what type of marketing activity is most likely to move a prospect from one stage to another within my buyer journey? Something along those lines. But the challenge that a lot of organizations have is that the data is really, really siloed. You have CRM data, marketing automation, customer interactions. And even if you take this data and this information and you pull it into, say, a data warehouse, whether it's Snowflake or BigQuery or Redshift, and you have that data sitting inside of these different data silos, the challenge is that data is still sitting there in its original format. You may have Salesforce data sitting over here, and then you have all of your Marketo interactions sitting over here, and you may have event data stream data coming in around ads and things like that sitting over here. It's still a siloed piece of information, even if you have it in a single data source. And the challenge is how do you link that data together? How do you do anything with those different silos to see different patterns and gain insights that you're looking for? So that's what we're going to kind of discuss today is how would you actually set up and do something like that given all these different data sources? Now, what you may be looking for is here's an example of a buyer journey that you may be looking to create out of all of those data sources, right? So in this case, you may be looking for what is the buying group within this company that I'm targeting? Who are the different people? What are their roles? How are they engaged? What are they getting engaged with? Maybe what are the key marketing activities? What are the things that are engaging with those different people? What's working? Maybe what's not working? And overall, what's the buyer journey? At what points in time did different individuals or roles get engaged and what did they do, right? And so how do you go from these different data silos, all this information, into something that looks like this? And this is a buyer journey that's actionable by you or your organization, something that you can actually do something with. And you may even want to take it a step further, right? You may want to take a whole bunch of those those buyer journeys, and then summarize them together to create sort of like a buyer persona view, or the ability to look across what's working for a grouping of companies or organizations. So here, you may summarize that data to say, what are the goals? What's the typical buying persona? And this one here may pick out you're selling to marketing operation leaders. What are the goals of those people? What are the pain points as it looks across those interactions? What maybe is the content that got them interested in your product or service? What type of engagements tend to work here? So, the real question is, how do you go from these data silos to something like this? So before we get a little bit too deep into this, I'm going to go over a number of definitions. Generative AI. These are tools that use advanced algorithms to models to basically predict sort of what's being, what to kind of say next based upon a certain set of input, right? It's something that, or they're trained on a very broad set of data, and they can do a very good job of understanding, language and information, and summarize that data into something that a marketer could probably use. You have data warehouses. Again, I've covered this a little bit, whether it's Redshift or BigQuery or Snowflake or maybe something over on Azure. This is a single location where you may be putting all of your data in a structured way so you can access it and use it. Now, two new terms are retrieval augmented generation, RAG, and data augmented generation, DAG. RAG, I'm not going to be going into too deeply, but you've probably heard that. It's a way of taking sort of unstructured data, putting it into a vector database so you can do a search against it to pull out context that you could feed into generative AI. DAG is very similar. It's really looking into direct databases and pulling out information and doing something similar, taking that data and feeding it into generative AI with some prompts to generate output that's really helpful. And the last thing I'm going to be talking about is what's called extract, load, and transform, ELT. This is a tool or a capability where you're extracting data from systems, say from Salesforce and Marketo and whatever. You're loading it into a data warehouse, and then you're transforming it after that into a set of data that you can actually use. Now here, I'm kind of cover like sort of how do these things actually all work in series. When you want to start to build a system that can go from these data sets all the way down to, sort of like, something you can interact and actually view and use, the first thing you have to do is you have to extract and load that data. Maybe using something like Fivetran or Google's data transfer service. It's getting the data out of those platforms and moving it into your data warehouse. The next thing you do is you need to transform that data. You need to take all these raw data tables. You got a Salesforce table here, and a Marketo table here, and maybe a website interaction table here, and an ad table here, and you need to transform that through data pipelines into sort of a consolidated set of data where information has been stitched and linked together. Now, this is not a trivial problem for many organizations. How do I make sure that this Marketo event attaches to the right account that I'm seeing over here from Salesforce? How do I know that this lead relates to, maybe these ads that kind of push something through my website, where I maybe have data coming from the ad platform that then pushes to my website, and I have links on my website that then need to link to the right account. I need to transform that data into this consolidated set of tables. Next, what you need to be able to do is you need to build a model on top of that, because now, even when you have all the data stitched together, you need to run algorithms, whether it's attribution modeling or engagement scoring, funnel models, maybe something used a little bit deeper from machine learning. You need to be able to add context to this data. A great example is within attribution. You'd use that to say, okay, of all my marketing campaigns and channels, which ones were the most effective at driving pipeline, right? Maybe from engagement scoring, I'm looking to understand what early signals do I see that indicate a customer is actually getting interested in my brand, and then how do I know at what point in time should I start to engage them? This may happen well before you maybe even have revenue associated with it. But you need to be able to create models that adds the context to it. Once you have that, you run RAG, or in this case DAG, to pull the data out, and you got to pull the right information out, maybe to extract a buyer journey, and then push that through something like Gemini, and then be able to interact with that data. So, to kind of review this, your first step in building a platform like this is you need to do the extract and the load. Again, using a tool, for instance, Fivetran, you have to set that up to connect to all of those different data sources, connector to Salesforce and a connector to Marketo and all that. And then you want to set that up on a schedule to pull the data into your data warehouse, right? And at this point in time now, you have all this raw data sitting in all of these tables. And there may be, to be honest, hundreds and hundreds of tables sitting inside your data warehouse that you need to start to work with. And at this point, you have some data that's interesting, but it really doesn't have a lot of value, intrinsic value at this point. Next, you'll do your transform. And this is where you use something like a combination of SQL, Python, Spark, or maybe some other technologies to create and build data pipelines. And these data pipelines stitch that data together, right? Give an example. To create a buyer journey, you need to understand that for this account and then these contacts and potentially leads, what's every marketing touch that relates to those individuals within the organization across all those platforms, right? So you need to do this transformation that kind of pulls it together and start stitching the data together at that point in time. And you may use that, it create another set of tables sitting inside that same data warehouse. And one last thing I'll touch base on there is you may need to be able to handle a combination of both known and unknown data within this database. Known data would be, hey, I know that this person did a specific interaction. They filled out a form on their website. That'd be something known. Unknown may be intent data. I know that this company, I don't know who at the company, has shown some level of intent around a topic that I'm interested in. Or they may use something like, I'm seeing that this company has hit my website, and then using IPD anonymization, I know that they're hitting specific content, but I don't know who they are yet, right? So you need to be able to stitch all of that data together. And at this point, you've got data that's starting to be interesting. It has context, it sits together. I could see buyer journeys, I could see some of this information. This is when the modeling comes into play. Right, so once it's been transformed, you can run these different models on top of it. And the models adds values to the data that relate to what's important to you as an organization. For example, multi-touch attribution is where you're going to take all those touch points and give them a little bit of weight and take the value of the opportunity and spread it out across those touch points. And then when you look at the different types of campaigns and touch points and sum them together, you can see how important are these to me. I may create a funnel model. And the funnel model says that at different sets of touch points that happen, I move this, I know how engaged they are, I move this company down my funnel until I can understand more and more, where they are kind of in my sales cycle. Right. And this modeling and this information layered on top of this data now has given context to all of this data. And now is when you can start to run very interesting reports. Tell me which campaigns are the most important to me. Tell me what channels drove what behavior. Tell me at what stage within my funnel the different roles have gotten engaged and what type of content do they engage with. I now have a lot of information there. Next, you want to be able to run your DAG architecture. Now, this is where things start to get very interesting. Now, what I need to do is I need to be able to craft a query that goes out to my database and pulls together a set of information. Let's say I want to create that buyer journey. I want to send that out. I want to grab a bunch of information. I want to pull that back in. And in that information is, for instance, every touch point, every marketing touch point for a specific account, right? And I've got that data. And then I want to maybe craft that data and dedupe it and strip it out. And then I want to combine it with a prompt to go to a generative AI model, for instance, Gemini from Google or ChatGPT from OpenAI. And when you combine those two, it's going to give you some output that can create a very interesting buyer journey that you can actually view and look at. Now, the art in this is that figuring out what data can be used well and then creating the prompt that can really manage that data they'll call it an evolving science, right? You need to really play around with the different data and the formatting and the prompt to get the output you want. But when you do, you can start to get some very interesting output from this information. And last, you need a way for your users to interact with this data, these buyer journeys, whether you want to use a system like CaliberMind where you're can interact directly with the data through reports and graphs. Maybe you want to take this and you want to send it as an email out to sales reps, or you want to have your marketing team be able to kind of look at this across a number of companies to see kind of what behavior is is being driven by your marketing activities, right? But you need a way of interacting with that data and that information. So that's a high-level overview of what you need to be able to do. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to go into and show an example of how to actually build a system like this using a AI-based workflow platform. In this case, I'm going to use a combination of CaliberMind for doing a bunch of this, and then N8N for actually kind of pulling some of this information together. So now for part 2, I'm going to show you sort of the basics of how you would build a buyer journey analysis using generative AI. And I'm going to sort of show you some of the tables and the schemas and the things that actually get kind of pulled together to actually build a system like this. Now, to be honest, I am relying on an application called CaliberMind behind the scenes, which is already doing a lot of the heavy lifting for me. It's connecting to all these different platforms and systems. It's pulling the data into a central data warehouse. It has all the pipelines and the stitching actually happening within that application. And I'm relying on it to kind of have all that data ready for me. But I will show you that same process of running through the ELT, doing the transformation, creating the models, and all of those things. So for step 1, I need to pull data in from, say, 3 tables: Salesforce, Google Ads, and website traffic, and kind of show you what that looks like. So here I've built out a framework using a AI-based tool called N8N sitting on top of CaliberMind to pull the data and do these transformations. And as you can see, at the top, I'm actually pulling in the raw data from all of those tables. So I'll just go ahead and execute some of these steps here. Pull in the Salesforce data, the Google Ad data, and the website data. And for demonstration purposes, I've really stripped down a lot of this information. I've made it much simpler. Grab the data here. There we go. I've made it a lot simpler than the real raw data table, which has literally hundreds of columns. But as you can see, I've pulled in a sample set of Salesforce data here, where I've pulled in a number of different companies. It's got their annual revenue, industry, and a few pieces of information. Again, this is a subset of all the information you would actually need to bring into the system. And I've done the same thing here for Google Ads. Let's kind of run that, take a look at the data. You can see here I may have ad groups and ad group names and the type of campaigns. And again, usually there's lots and lots of data and columns in here. And finally, I've pulled in some website data. Test that step. And this is interactions happening on the website. Where is the data coming into? What's the context? What's the path? The title of the web page, the URL, all of this information. You would also need to kind of understand potentially cookie IDs and things like that, so you could stitch the data up later together. So now that I have all of that data, I can now move on to my next step, which is the transformation stage. So once you have those raw data tables, you want to stitch everything together. And I'm going to show you kind of 2 resulting tables here after a lot of that stitching that are very important. We have a company table, and we have an event table. Now the company table is very similar to the account table in Salesforce, but you've pulled together a lot more data and information. And in addition, at the company level, you've deduped the data, made sure you only have single accounts, you've stitched everything maybe using a website address or a domain or something like that. And then you have an event table. And an event table is think of it as a single table of all of the touch points that are happening across all of these platforms and systems, and how they relate to this specific company, and then potentially to individuals, people, roles, and all of that. So going in here, I am going to pull in the company table. Let's test that. And you can see, again, I'm just limiting down to a few of the columns, but here's the company names, the company type, the tier, which is actually a enhanced piece of data, and some revenue that's been put on top of it. So now I'm going to show you events. Now, events are really every marketing touch point, right, kind of stitched together for a specific company. And so I'm going to jump into this node here, and I've run the test on this node, and I'm pulling the events for a specific company ID. And you can see these events can be lots of different touch points, marketing touch points within the system, right? So I'm showing some surging here. This is probably being pulled for something like a Bombora intent data, where it's showing that this company was looking up analytics. I'm running, I'm looking at some attribution where they actually potentially came in and looked at specific pages. I've got Apollo emails probably flowing in from Salesforce. These are probably sales emails going out. Again, I can go through here and I've got all of these different marketing touch points that are associated with this company now. And this provides the basis for actually creating and understanding the buyer journey for these organizations. After that, I'm going to want to be able to do the modeling. And in case the modeling, it kind of takes all those touch points and it adds contextual data and information. In this case, I'm going to take those same event touch points for that same company, but I'm going to add maybe a score to them, like how valuable are those to my organization? Now, I'm not going to go too deep into that, but different models can create different scores for engagement. In this case, we're using a regression algorithm to actually go back and weight all the different touch points across time for all the organizations and understand how valuable they are to your organization. And then we assign a score, and then you use that score and attach it to these different touch points to understand like how engaged is an organization, right? So here, I'm going to jump into the model, run the test against that, and you can see I now have those similar touch points, right? Using a model here, here's those surging, here's the emails, but now I've got some information about it. I have a score associated with these. All of these are worth 1 point. Let's see if I've got some values down here. Yep, I've got some things that we've decided are actually worth a little bit more. That could be because maybe the person has a different role within the organization. It could be that the system and the weighting of it decided that, hey, these types of emails worth more. Oh, here we go. I had somebody come in and do some drift, probably directly integrate or talk to someone at the organization, look for a demo, and those got a lot of engagement, right? So again, the model is creating these engagement scores, which can actually help understand and put some context to all of these marketing events. So now finally, now that we've got all that data and the model in there, we actually want to run the retrieval or the data augmentation for the generative AI piece here. But the first thing we want to know is, what questions are we really trying to answer with this system? There's lots of different questions we could maybe look at, like we could maybe potentially summarize the buyer journey for an account in a way a marketer could really easily understand. Maybe you want to understand like the difference between accounts that were recently won versus ones that were lost. Understand their personas for different roles in the organization, what type of marketing content that actually gets them most engaged. Maybe you want to plot like what are the natural buying groups within these organizations, right? Each question may require a different set of data and a different marketing prompt or prompt for the LLM to be able to analyze it and pull it all together. So for case one, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go and pull the buyer journey for a specific company, combine it with a prompt, send it to Gemini, and create this outbound, like a buyer journey for that organization that could then be used later on. So to do that, the first thing we'll do is go, and this is a little bit more of a sophisticated query. It's pulling data together. It's doing a fair amount of items. But once I test that, I now have all of the marketing events, very similar to that event table, but I'm pulling together raw score and weighted score, but I'm adding some other information there, like the systems and the events and the people, and I'm pulling together a lot of data for this buyer journey right here. Once I have that, I'm doing some simple data manipulation. I'm dropping some columns out of the data. I'm doing some things to kind of get the data prepped and ready to go into the LLM. I'm converting it to a CSV file. The reason I do that is that we've done a lot of experimentation with generative AI, and we found that when you take the data, if you send it in using JSON or these other formats, it tends to blow up the number of tokens. I won't get too deep into what that means, but it increases your cost by converting it into a CSV file. It's actually a really good way of condensing the data, and the Gemini in particular tends to recognize and be able to process CSV data very well. And so now I'm going to run this actually against Gemini. And so this is taking that CSV file, it's hitting an endpoint within our project against Gemini. And one of the important things that you need to remember is that when you're dealing with large language models, you need to make sure that you're dealing with them in a way that preserves the integrity and security of the data that you're using. So you really want to make sure that you actually have a large language model that you can embed directly in your project, where the data never leaves your project, that you don't have to worry about your query going and being used for further training, so you can preserve the security of that data for the organization that you're working with. I'm now converting that data from Markdown, which is the format that is coming out, to HTML. And now I'm outputting the HTML. We can go look at that buyer journey. And there we go. We've created that data. We've pulled it in. We've turned it into some HTML. And I now have the buyer group. You know, what's the buying group? What are the key marketing activities? And what's the buyer journey, right? And that was created from this. So I took this outpoint data. You know, I dropped a few columns off of it, right? And created the following table here, where you just kind of selected the columns and mapped the ones I wanted together, converted it into a CSV file, right? Oops, it's a binary, and then reviewed it in HTML right here. And to give an example, that output went from this here, which is the direct output from the Gemini model, to something that looks usable by a marketer right here in HTML. Now, in a system like CaliberMind, we have a lot of this capability built right into the system, where you can go in, look at a company, and then see the buyer journey. But this is how you would kind of go from these raw data tables all the way to a buyer journey. So next, I'm going to be reviewing how to actually pull together a lot of these and create a more consolidated buyer journey that maybe looks at a bunch of accounts and picks out like the natural buying groups. For part 3, we're going to take a slightly more sophisticated use case and apply it into this model. In this case, what I want to do is I want to understand what are the personas for a different group of accounts that tend to buy or interact with our brand. And based upon that, what are their key pain points? What content do they deal with? You know, like how do they interact and how best do they actually buy from us? So I can replicate that for further accounts downstream. And so when I do that, I need to start to think about a number of items before I sort of start to build out this system. One is how many accounts, how many companies, how many contacts are required to actually sort of be meaningful to my answer. Pulling together, you know, 3 or 4 buyer journeys may be interesting, but that may not be enough data to actually create a meaningful result set that you can actually analyze and look at. Now, taking hundreds may be too big, in which case you may be generating so much data it's very hard to send that and use a large language model to do any analysis on it. In this case, we're going to use about 20 different buyer journeys, which I think is about the minimum that you need to create sort of a meaningful result set. But when you do that, you have to also consider what is the context window? Like what is the biggest amount of data that I can give to my large language model that it can process well? And that varies depending on the LLM you're using. Gemini's is 2 million tokens. I believe OpenAI is 1 million tokens. They may have gone up from there since last time I looked. Others even have smaller context windows. And when you're using a buyer journey that may have thousands and thousands and thousands of marketing events, you can pretty quickly actually start to fill up those context windows. So the question is there any data manipulation you need to do on that information to consolidate it down and make it more meaningful so the large language model can actually extract more context out of it, right? So in this case, I'm going to take 20 companies. I'm going to then, out of the database, I'm going to pull them into our system. I'm going to run a simple transformation on this where I'm going to take marketing events that are similar in time and for the individuals that actually executed them and just sort of merge them together and put a counter on it. So what that says is if I had 20 web page hits for the same item or 20 ad clicks for the same item at a similar time frame for the same company, I probably don't need to actually have every line item in there. I can probably consolidate that data up. And what that's going to do is that's going to shrink my overall data set down and make it easier for the LLM to process. Post that, I'm going to run a similar process. Take a prompt, combine it with the buyer journey, send it to Gemini, and get back out something that hopefully looks like a consolidated understanding, in this case, of personas and things like that. And let me show you what that looks like. So here, I'm going to first pull a bunch of companies out of the system. I'm going to get all the events for all of those companies. I'm going to do some data manipulation on it. Here I'm going to drop a few of the columns that I'm pulling in. You can see that in my first test run, it's pulling in 2,500 events. I'm then going to do that data consolidation step where I'm actually consolidating data. And then the rest here is similar to the previous iterations where I'm converting it to a CSV to make it easier to process, running it through the LLM, and then turning it into something we can actually look at. And here I'll go ahead and run that. So I'm pulling the companies. I pulled 20 companies out of the system. Now I'm going out and getting all those marketing events. So it's actually looping through each of those companies and grabbing the events for each of those. This is kind of pulling together what is a somewhat large set of information that I can then use for the downstream processing, right? And it's going to take a couple seconds here. Oh, there we go. It's done. So there's 2,500 marketing events that happen for these 20 companies. So that's actually a relatively good set of data. That means that I have 2,500 discrete, individual, inbound. What that means is a marketing event that actually was meaningful. Somebody actually clicked on an ad, they responded to an email, they interacted with my web page, as opposed to outbound. Outbound we're ignoring here. Let's drop those columns. Let's do the data consolidation. And just to show you in the data consolidation, we went from that input of 2,500 items, cut it more than in half. Convert it to CSV. Let's run it now out against Gemini. And so what it's doing is taking all that data, it's combining it with my prompt. My prompt is relatively simple. It's essentially saying, I want you to analyze this data. Here's the format of the data. And I want you to tell me about what's going on inside of this information. I want you to tell me the natural buying groups and the personas that are in here and the types of things and activities that they tend to actually do with me as a brand. And that's going to take a second to process because this is a rather large event set to send against the LLM. In sort of more data science terms, there's actually a fair number of tokens being pushed in there. Now, because of the consolidation step, there's half as many tokens. And let's run it through the downstream processes and go see what that looks like. So you can see here on the right that it's actually done a pretty good job of converting this data over. So I have a buying group, marketing leadership. It's telling me their titles and roles that are involved in there. Actually looks like it's actually using names in the titles. That could be something in my source data. What are their goals? Improve marketing ROI, gain a holistic view of marketing performance, optimization. These are good things, but what I like is that this is what the marketing leadership people are looking at, and how do they engage with marketing? What content appealed to them? Then I could go down here and say, well, we also have another buying group, marketing operations and engineering. Here are their goals, here are their pain points, here are their content interests. And then I have another group here, which is what I call it anonymous. These are people who the system is seeing, but it doesn't know who they are. And that is actually pretty interesting because it says that anonymous users are engaging with the G2 reviews, a lot of the surging. We have Bombora Surge plugged in here at the same time, DocSend visits. Like, these are what they're engaging with at that level. And you can see that it's done a really good job pulling together that entire buyer journey. And like some of the things that I would do is the next step, I would look at this and say like, well, why am I seeing names in the titles? Was that an artifact of running it through the LLM? Or do I have a data mapping issue earlier in my process, which I very well might. And I could go through and edit that. And I could do things and give an instruction and say like, make sure that titles are real titles, not names. The LLM would learn from that and actually be able to kind of move ahead with that data and that information. So now we've gone from looking at a lot of different data across a bunch of different data sets, consolidating that data into a single system, stitching that data together, and then transforming that data through analytics into something that a large language model can actually interpret and understand and give you an analysis of, so that your marketing teams can actually make better decisions around how to actually work with, target, and get to their prospects and basically their prospects and refine their marketing campaigns, right? Now, I'm just going to kind of review a couple of the gotchas that we've seen in this system. The first is that large language models are very sensitive to input and instructions. You need to test not just the prompts that you're building, but the data that you're feeding it, and make sure that you're structuring the data in a way that can optimize and that the LLM can actually readily use and interpret, right? Consolidating data, giving it counters where it needs to kind of understand the importance of different items, things like that. Another thing you need to worry about is that these context windows of these LLMs can vary, right? And if you start to exceed that context window, you'll start to lose data. These requests will fail. For example, I ran this on 20 users or 20 accounts. I could probably run it on 30, 40, maybe 50. But if I tried to run this on 200 or 300 accounts, I would exceed that context window pretty quickly with the number of marketing events. At which point in time, it would start to drop a lot of that information. And I may be thinking that I'm getting a good result back, but I'm actually not. It's actually skipping and just not even looking at a bunch of the data and information in there. The output can vary pretty dramatically from one call to the next. We saw that in that last example where I was seeing titles, but it said titles, but it was actually giving me names of people. That's not atypical at this point with large language models. It's something that's getting better over time, but it's something you need to kind of watch out for. You need to actually tell it explicitly when you see those things. Hey, and by the way, treat these things like this. Cost can also be an issue with these systems. You know, I think that Google on 200,000 characters costs about 25 cents. So if you're going to run these things, you need to really understand when you're running them, how you're running them, how often and what frequency you're going to be running them on. And then kind of the last two things is that things are changing really, really fast within this market. LLMs are getting better. They're releasing new LLMs, you know, new frontier models almost every 4 or 5 months, right? And so you need to, if you're building something, make sure that you build it in a way that allows you to absorb that change and take advantage of it, so that when these models get better, once you run some tests, boom, you can just turn them back on in your new system. So in summary, to build one of these systems, 5 steps. You need to access all of your data sources. You need to have access to all the data sets. You need to be able to, you know, including CRMs and app platforms and marketing automation. Once you've pulled all that data into a marketing data warehouse, you need to build data pipelines that can consolidate and stitch all that data together. With that, you build your analytics on top, right? So you want to build things like attribution models and engagement scoring and maybe funnel analytics and these types of things, right? That you can actually layer on top of that data. Before you start to build out and integrate your large language models, you want to understand really very clearly what are the questions that you want to ask and what do you want to actually build out within the system, right? And then you can start building out the supporting pipelines to kind of pull the data together in a way that can support answering those questions, right? And the last step you need to do is build out an interface layer, something so that your end users can interact with a system like this. Whether it's you're pushing the data directly into Salesforce, you're displaying it inside of an application where they can actually access it and see all this data and information, or maybe you're sending it to Slack or Microsoft Teams or one of these other applications. There needs to be a way for your users to interact with this data. So thank you. I hope the series was helpful and gives you at least a super high level view on how you would go from raw data across hundreds of different marketing systems all the way to consolidated buyer journeys, leveraging the power of AI and large language models.